There's a cognitive bias called the halo effect. When you have a positive first impression of something or someone, it can be difficult to see them in any other light than positive. That's why first impressions matter on a date, in an interview, and when evaluating whether a career field is for you. The opposite of the halo effect is called the horn effect, where we ascribe negative attitudes or perceptions based on a negative experience or first impression. Both are biases we want to avoid, or at least be aware of. They are sticky, difficult to shake off, and can create lasting bonds or trust issues like an unfortunate blind date or the first betrayal you experienced in adolescence. Starting in 2008, cell phones and social media quickly escalated into our daily lives. Millennials filled the lower ranks of the force while op tempos reached exhausting levels and sequestration tainted the beginning of a second decade of war as it forced us to dangerously downsize. The halo effect left many Gen X and older millennials confused, trying to reconcile their positive expectations of the military with reality. Technology provided a megaphone to an eager and fearless generation that had a lot to say and now access to influential leaders who they felt needed to hear it. In Chapter 6, I shared the story of Amy, a millennial journalist for military.com and a military spouse who gave voice to the betrayal she and other families felt as service members were handed pink slips instead of promotions. Amy was just one of many examples of how millennials aim to bring about change. Amy later became an editor for military.com and is known as one of the most competent voices on a lot of military issues, especially understanding the Tricare system. I asked Amy to come on the podcast to share what she remembers from that decade, but also the shifts she saw in the culture as she covered it over the years. I'm Corie Weathers. You're listening to Military Culture Shift, a limited series podcast on the impact of war, money, and generational perspective on morale, retention, and leadership. So Amy, I quoted you in the book talking, I think it was 2015 when you wrote an article. I remember the word betrayal was just such a huge word, but it was 2014, right after sequestration, and there was layoffs going on, and there was just a lot of intense anxiety. And it was such a strong article. I don't know if you remember writing that article. I know I've reached out to you since including it in the book, but you were writing for, I think, several years before that. And you've since become an editor for military.com. And now you're on to other things. So you've had a whole career of really covering this culture. But that article was actually a personal op-ed. So do you mind sharing what you remember from that article?
As you said, the year is 2014. It was summer. I remember working on this article while sitting in my car outside of my kids' swim lesson. As do many spouses who work, we sit in odd places and work on work, right? So I'm like literally in a car that I have turned off because I'm trying to keep it quiet. I'm trying to talk to someone on the phone, but it is a bajillion degrees in Tennessee. And so turning the car back on quickly was my priority. And it's a visceral moment, right? Because you're sweating. So you can feel it physically, like you're in this moment and you're thinking about this weighty stuff. And I was talking to a friend on the phone who was the spouse of a U.S. Army captain, and they were dealing with having received what we sort of call pink slip, but it's just a nice way to say you're fired. And it was the Army saying to them, hey, we are getting rid of a certain number of people in your military officer year group. So that group of people who are within that same promotion zone that you are. And we're doing that because we're cutting. We're cutting because we have less money. We're cutting because the force is shrinking. We're cutting because cutting is what we're doing now. And it felt like a betrayal to people who had intended to stay in the military service for a very long time. And it felt like a betrayal because the parameters that they were using for deciding who to cut and who to keep felt in a lot of ways arbitrary.
Mm.
If you had any sort of questionable marks on your service record, any investigation, even if the investigation was proven unwarranted, any medical problems that perhaps were service related, but were overcomable if the military wanted to work with you. If you had these things in your service packet, you were being let go if you were within this zone group. And it felt like people had sacrificed their youth, had sacrificed their educational window where you're in that young 20-something, had sacrificed plans, had sacrificed family, had sacrificed their health and well-being to be in the military long-term as a career. And instead, they were being reduced, sequestered, if you will.
Well, and there's so many things that I could like pull apart, even in this one example. First of all, I unpack not only the strong words that you use in that article, and it wasn't just that you were saying this is how families are feeling, but I think what was remarkable, the more I looked at your article, you're a millennial. I think you're an older millennial.
I am an elder, if you will, say quite elderly.
Elder. And the more I looked at kind of what was happening before and after all that, I think what really stood out to me is that before the group that was especially spouses, before the millennials came in, this was not something that you said out loud. The culture was different. Like there was a lot of thought about if you have something negative to say, if you have something critical to say, that there's certain ways that you handle that information. And most of it, you just don't say at all. Right. And so I think that your article was a really good example of a shift of several things. One, it was millennials coming in and really processing and being willing to process what they were feeling out loud. But I think that your article was also what later I think was called almost kind of jumping the chain of command and really publicly saying out loud, here's the concerns that we have. And I know in the media world, that's something we do all the time, right? It's something that something is not right. We talk about it. But I think for you being a military spouse too, I think it was a part of a bigger shift, a generational shift coming in that was saying, we're not afraid to say what we're feeling out loud. Does that make any sense to you?
It does. I think that generationally before us, there was a mentality where you take your flogging quietly and go home and lick your wounds in silence. And you don't say anything about it to anybody. And that's just how it is, right? So if that means you're getting out, you're getting out and you just fade into the unknown. If that means you're getting demoted or owe money or like have a charge against your paycheck because someone else made a mistake, all of these things, you just do them and you don't say anything to anybody. And for an internet generation where we have the power of blogging and the availability of publication broadly at our fingertips without any sort of gatekeeping, which is really what the internet gave us. If you go back and look at this sort of trajectory of blogs and website writing writ large for everybody, not just military spouses, obviously, we were given an opportunity to have no gatekeeping and to speak to power in so much that we were speaking. And if power saw it, good.
Yeah. Well, and what do you happen to remember? I mean, you've written so many articles and op-eds too. Do you remember, was there pushback a little bit around that time? It doesn't have to be with that particular article, but just when you were a little bit more open, you had, I mean, obviously military.com through you has this access, not only for your talent, but also you as a spouse. Did you feel like there was any pushback that you saw around that time when millennials are starting to come in?
I felt like, okay, so we were in a very difficult deployment in 2009, 2010. Okay. And so, and of course, in the military, a difficult deployment, that's code for a bunch of people died. Lots of people got hurt. Many widows were, and moms whose sons have been killed and so on and so forth are left behind. That's what that means, quote unquote, difficult. It's like saying it's very kinetic. Well, that just means there was like a lot of explosions, right? All of these are militarisms for things that suck. We were in this deployment and it was really the heyday of this in culturally of blogging all over the US, but in all of the world, but in terms of the military culture, it was the beginning of that. Okay.
Yeah.
And so we were seeing
The beginning of
crowdsourcing.
more people dying in mass casualty almost.
Well, and that had, yes, it certainly was a peak of that in Afghanistan. That had been going on in Iraq for several years at that point. But it was the beginning of where the military saw that spouses felt okay saying their piece. Okay. Yeah. Crowdsourcing was a thing. Twitter was at its peak in a lot of ways. And I had this moment at a candlelight vigil. I don't know if you and I have ever talked about this, at a candlelight vigil where after we had 7 or so soldiers killed in one incident, it was the week after the Fort Hood shootings. Mm-hmm. Yep. So there was a lot going on in the military that over those couple of weeks. Tensions were very high on the home front. Lots and lots of stress. The President Obama went to Fort Hood to attend their memorial service. Vice President Biden came to Fort Lewis to attend ours. Okay, that's the vibe. Mm-hmm. We had held a candlelight vigil for ourselves, really, and the rear detachment commander, so the guy in charge of all of the, well, really he's supposed to be in charge of the soldiers stateside, but practically speaking, he's in charge of the wives. Mm-hmm. And the memorial services, pulls me aside and wants to know if I know how the local reporter is getting information on the unit. Okay. And if I know how he's writing his stories. And I do know, because he's getting the same press releases I am at military.com, which have information. He's getting the same crowdsourced information I'm seeing, independent of being in the unit, mm-hmm. that NATO is confirming that people died. But there is a sense that there are spouses ratting on the unit to this reporter in Tacoma, Washington. Mm. And it was this moment where this guy, like, bless his heart, he's not trying to point fingers. He's getting heat from the chain of command, right? Yeah. Like that's how that goes. And so the chain of command is concerned that spouses have something to say about the situation that's very emotional for everyone and very tragic, without question. And there should be a chain. And there is a moment where you're like, no, this information stays private. We don't talk about the names until it's released to the family, even if you happen to know them. And that's what I walked him through, just sort of the rules of engagement from a media perspective. And the reporter, whose name was Scott Fontaine and has worked now for the State Department for a very long time, that's the rules he was playing by, mm-hmm. that he wasn't broadcasting names either, even if he had people in the unit telling him mm-hmm. what they were, because that's not how that rolls.
It was just part of the moral code.
Part of the moral code. And you know that in the unit and out of the unit. And you could see, however, that there was this moment where they were reckoning with the idea that spouses had platforms. And some of those spouses with the largest platforms were in their unit.
Mm. So you saw this shift, and then, we also had a mass casualty 2009, 2010. And I also remember just it becoming a lot more challenging for where is everybody talking? Where is information going out? Do we have control? And can we get even to the houses to notify people in time before, mm-hmm. Information is circulated in another way? And it wasn't necessarily through phone calls, right? Mm-hmm. Like this is really building over time. And so I want to go back to your article, though, too, because I think that the article in 2014, and I'm hoping I have that year right, but I'm pretty sure it was, I think that the other shift that, other than kind of this truth to power, and also being a military spouse, the way that you were talking about aloud, I think it was also this interesting shift. If you have this whole generation, and I want to know what you think about this, but this is just an assumption, a theory, if you will. But there's this whole generation that one of the reasons why people were feeling betrayed is that there was a whole cohort that planned to go to 20. Like this was their long-term plan. This was their lifestyle they had adopted. They had trusted the DoD for all the provision that the DoD had promised them and their family. And so they were in for the long haul. And I think something has shifted now. I don't know if people are coming in with the same mentality, especially with the new retirement system, where not everybody's coming in with the expectation that this is a 20-year, I wonder if there was more people then that really saw this as a lifetime commitment versus maybe some now that see it as, let's just try it and see. I know that there was those people too, back, especially at the beginning of 9/11. But what are your thoughts on that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. I think you're spot on with that. I think that there was a cultural shift happening in the elder millennialness that we are a part of, where even outside of the military, people were moving from this idea that you're going to have the same job for your entire life, that you work for 20 years and you get a pension from Whirlpool, or you work from 20 years and you get a pension from the school district or whatever, right? To this idea that careers are a long haul with many different stops on the haul versus just the one spot. And that cultural shift happens in the military and outside of it. Yeah. And so, yes, the new retirement system, which, in case people don't know what that is, it's no longer sort of a 20-year pension based. You pay into it over time, and it has different payouts based off of, it's more like a 401k kind of option that you could opt into were you in the old one. And it may or may not have been a good idea to do that, depending on how long you wanted to stay. That retirement system is certainly one marking of that happening. But I think that it was happening culturally outside of the military before that. And that was, again, the military catching up. It's so funny to me because there are so many examples of the military really being on the forefront of social change. And then there are so many examples of the military really being at the back of the pack. Yeah. And I'm not sure there are any examples of the middle. Like, it's just dramatically one or the other, where we're in the very back or in the very front. And I'll give you examples of the very front, desegregation in schools. Yeah. So, right, like we know that desegregation in schools happened in the South, first and foremost at military installations where military schools were on base. So the actor previously known as Fort Benning, now Fort Moore, has on-base schools because they were desegregated when the rest of the schools in that area were not. The retirement system is a great example of not so much in the front. So
not so much in the front.
Not so much.
Well, and okay, so man, I really want to go on this rabbit trail. So maybe we should, because I want to know, you have been covering the military for how long now?
Oh gosh, since I married, since before I married into it. So 2007-ish. 2006. Depends what you mean by covering. It's been a long time.
Almost 2 decades. Almost 2 decades, right?
Yes.
And so I really am curious of like the shifts and changes that you've seen over those 2 decades, because that's really where I became curious from a psychological perspective. What are the psychological shifts relationally in the force, whether it's generation to generation, or what are the dynamics happening in the spouse culture or the service member culture, the shifts of leadership, like all those kinds of things are fascinating to me. But you have actually, from a media journalist perspective, covered the military, especially, like you became known as the person who had the most information on Tricare for sure, and how that evolved over time. So I really want your perspective on that, and definitely weave in your perspective as a spouse over time too. But I really want to maybe go on the rabbit trail of what you just mentioned, because I've been thinking about this, especially in the last week. There's so much talk about retention, recruitment, and what has changed. And that's really what's on the forefront of my mind. And the topic in the last week has really been about, the military being behind the civilian culture. When you talk about jobs and you were talking about benefit packages and work climates that are now available. Matt told me even yesterday, Google offers, I think, 24 counseling sessions a year to their employees, regardless of where you want to go. Like, they just tell the employees, you tell me the clinician that you're choosing and we'll cut the check. Like, that is a whole other topic when it comes to caring for your employees. And so there's a lot of competing jobs out there that are that I feel like the military is behind on. But I had this thought this past week, and I'm curious what your thought is. I think that the American culture, and I think probably global too, has become so individualized. So everything is tailored to a person's values. Like, it's okay for my values to be different from your values and different from someone else's values. The way you parent is you tailor. So many millennial and Gen Z are parenting tailoring it to each kid, like what each kid's needs are, their health needs, their parenting needs. It's becoming more of an on-demand culture. Everything is based off of customizing the way each individual wants. I think that my guess is the military culture is what feels like the last stand of a community and culture where everybody agrees on a certain kind of values together. And those values also being other, like outside of yourself, like that it's always been about serving the person next to you, or that we are fighting for something bigger than ourselves. And that we are, considering we're 1% of the American population, that we're lagging behind the American culture that is not necessarily agreeing on these core set of values, not even about patriotism anymore either. So in that sense, I think that we might have something going for us when it comes to retention and recruitment, if we can hold out and because I think Gen Z is looking for that. But I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, point well taken. I think that it's not the only one of that. I think it might be the most dramatic, largest example.
Yeah,
however,
please give me
I think
some examples.
Yeah, so it's been fun to be in a civilian community to gain a little bit of perspective on the military from the spot of not being in it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I see similarities to what you just described in any public service focused job industry. So that would be firefighters, teachers, police, these sorts of different, like service above self.
Mm-hmm.
Anything that you could say, oh, well, they don't go into that for the money. Right. That's it. Right. And there are a lot of examples of that, unfortunately, because they are also the things we need more than anyone and anything else.
Medical community.
Medical community. Oh, no one does that for the money. Okay. Well, if that's what we're saying about something, that sounds one, terrible. And two, and it sounds like an excuse for a setup that is not focused on keeping people healthy. Because there's a big difference between individualized feelings and this sort of postmodernism guided, you do you. There's a big difference between that and doing things that are good for the health of the employee. And I think the military in particular blames the oh, it's just for you mentality as a reason to not have the health of the person in the forefront.
Ooh, say more on that. Unpack that.
Okay. Yeah. So if we really felt like the health of the person was the forefront, we would do what Google is doing, right?
Yeah.
The VA or the DoD would do what Google's. I see it's very difficult for you to find mental health care in your community because we have a shortage and because billing Tricare is terrible, as we know.
Yeah.
Just tell us who you want and we'll make it work, which we know they can do because we have VA choice. That the system is kind of based off of that, predicated on that idea. Okay. Instead, they try to stuff us all in this thing while legislators and policymakers blame wokeism.
Right.
And this, everybody's just following what they want to do sort of feeling. You can see I'm a little salty about this, right? It's not the same thing. And it discredits the idea that people understand themselves and what they need. I come out of a culture, a very conservative culture that spends a lot of time talking about your truth and my truth and how terrible that entire dichotomy is. And they're not completely wrong about that. But there is such a thing as gray area. It doesn't have to be black or white in the world. And I think that this is one of these instances where just because you know what you need as a person doesn't mean that you're redefining truth for yourself. There is like a middle ground there. Yeah.
So what do you look back on our culture over the last 2 decades? What are some of the biggest shifts that you saw and were tracking? I was looking at spouse culture, the way that families are interacting, the impact of social media and all that, but you're obviously tracking some of that too. But when you look back and you see what the culture is today and what we're struggling with today, what do you feel were the contributing factors?
Yeah, so I would say that there has been a reckoning from the DoD that spouses aren't just stay-at-home moms eating bonbons and sitting, like this whole like trope of God help me, I'm going to use this term, dependopotamus. That's the last time we're using that word in this conversation, right? But there's like this trope of a military spouse being uneducated, lazy, just sort of around. And it's the same kind of thing that feeds into this idea that we have endless volunteer hours at our disposal, that we don't have anything else to do, that we're not contributing members of society outside of the military family readiness group structure. This idea that I'm just sitting here serving my service member, and that's all I'm doing. That I have no other education or other thing. Now, I love serving my service member and my family and supporting his mission, right? But I have other talents and education, as do many, most all military spouses. And the DoD really has had to come to a reckoning of that. And instead of begrudgingly offering military spouse employment help, because it seems like something that might keep mama happy, and if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy, they now offer it because they have to. And this is a fundamental shift in the way the DoD handled military family stuff. Okay. It used to be that it was to keep mom from complaining. And I'm using female genders here because so many military spouses traditionally are female. We know that is growing increasingly not the case. So forgive me for using she's and hers here. But this idea that to do that, it was just to keep mom happy and from complaining too much. And now it is seen as a vital retention tool because the whole family is a unit that matters, and those needs rise to the top too. It's not just to keep her quiet.
Well, and can I also say, I think one of the things, I actually was talking with a spouse this morning. It was a general's wife that was trying, probably late Gen X, maybe boomer, that they're also trying to figure out, like, things have changed. Like, how do we lead, encourage, mentor, given so many things have changed? And we were having this conversation about how fewer people are showing up, or people are geobaching or choosing to go home to be with family during a deployment rather than sticking around. And one of the questions I asked was, we need to remember, even if we did say, hey, it's worth it for you to stick around and endure this deployment with your neighbors, that doesn't mean that they're going to have the experience that we had, where our whole block was deployed at once, when their neighbor may not be deploying at all. So we could end up like setting them up for sabotage, really, to say, hey, this is going to be a wonderful community where you're going to get all the support that you need. And yet their neighbor, their spouse is home and the door is shut and they're having family time, right? And so I think that there is also spouses and families, not just spouses. There are couples, military couples, millennials especially, that are saying, we value the service member is saying, we'll just say it's not a dual service, right? The service member is even saying, I value my spouse's career just as much as I want my spouse to value mine. I've even seen some millennial service members leaving and turning in their packets because their spouse is earning more with a better benefits package than they have, and they're willing to follow their spouse. And so when we talk about these military spouses who are not the traditional stay-at-home spouses, and they are wanting to be professionals and they're wanting to work, I wonder if this is going to be a generation that, I think traditionally the DoD waits out cohorts that are unhappy. I think it's been their MO. And I wonder if this generation, millennial and Gen Z, is going to be the generation that waits out the DoD, that says, no, we have different values, and we're going to value dual employment. And we're willing to do whatever we have to do on our side. And I wonder if they hold out long enough, if that's going to affect, hopefully, I hope, relocation, the amount of moves that are happening, because it's going to force the DoD to change if the younger generations are going to hold out and wait on the DoD to say, this is not a good conducive environment for our families if my spouse can't work.
Yeah, I think so. I tend to agree on that. And I would say that we've seen test balloons on that. So every now and then the DoD will put out some sort of family policy, or whisper of a family policy, or rumor of a family policy, or perhaps, my favorite, a study on a potential family policy. And it will look like an order from Congress in the National Defense Authorization Act. It'll look like a study proposed and ordered out of the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And it asks the question, what happens if we have less PCS moves? Mm-hmm. What happens if we spend more money on spouse careers? What happens if we give more funding to spouse education? Mm-hmm. What happens if we give people more money to pay for pet relocation? Okay. Mm-hmm. And some of these policies fizzle out. For example, I have heard, and what I'm going to call an unsubstantiated rumor, because I haven't seen any reporting on this, that the DoD is going to once again slacken their military spouse career advancement accounts, known as MyCAA. It's this long-running education support program that they had, and then it was super popular and it paid for everything, and then they took it away because it paid for too much, and then they brought it back again, but it only paid for some people. And then a few years ago, they increased it to pay for more people. So it expanded to other groups of officers, spouses, essentially. I heard a rumor that they're slackening it again, that they're decreasing it. Is that because it's so popular that too many people are using it? Is it because it's not popular enough and they're allocating funds to this and they're not getting spent and now they're going to spend them somewhere else? I don't know. I have no idea. I don't even know if the rumor is true. But what I'm saying is that's a great example of things that are true that have happened, where these programs grow and shrink and come and go in a test balloon fashion to see how people respond. And so what I would say to that is, if you're listening to this and you are a military spouse and you have the opportunity to respond and something is important to you that is changing, you should say so, because these folks claim to listen to military spouse feedback. So let's try them on that.
Yeah.
Let's find out if that's true.
Which is, again, it sounds like a normal thing, but I feel like this kind of communication has really only been this transparent in the last 10 years, I feel like.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of older generations that are still adjusting to communication being this transparent, where we can speak truth to power, or speak opinion to power, and actually feel like the voice is actually going to be heard. And
I want to back up really fast and make clear that when I say these people, I actually mean a conglomerate of people. I don't mean any actual individual person. This is an organizational decision and an organizational culture in the beautiful 5-sided building. Okay. So we know, you and I personally know, people in positions of power in the Office of the Secretary of Defense's Family Policy Office. Okay. They are wonderful human beings who I know for a fact, because I personally know them, are doing their best to make spouse voices heard. So it's not any one individual's situation. It is a cultural situation. So I want to make sure, no, I'm not blaming anybody, because I don't think there's anyone to blame.
Agree. And I think even in the book, I write, like, everybody is doing the best that they can. And this is a wicked problem. And that's why I think these conversations are so important to have, because there's so many variables, so many different dynamics that change and shift and are difficult to stay on top of, that I feel like only with dialogue do we have better understanding of why things are the way that they are, and to even know, what can I do? Like, to your point, who can I talk to, and how do I express something is important to me? And there's just so much information out there that our whole world and experience is oversaturated. It's hard to cut through the noise and know that, one, our voice is valuable. Two, where do I actually say something? Because I make the joke all the time, we're in a culture now where you can tweet your congressman and say, I need another trash can. And apparently we don't have enough funding for that. Right. And so that's just the way that things have broken down in that way. I would love to also ask you, what is your perspective and your opinion on how morale has shifted and changed over the 2 decades, maybe let's say, especially since 9/11, what would you say, if you were to zoom out and look at the whole military culture, what have you seen happen with morale, with families and service members, like at the whole culture?
Yeah, that's such a tough question, because my gut reaction to say it's not very good, but but I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that's a one person's view in a time and spot. I'm not saying morale in this house is low, but but however, I am also my perspective today is primarily informed by the National Guard. And that is a whole different ballgame, friends, because you're dealing with a group of people who have very set expectations on their service commitments that may not be reflected in reality, nor are they reflected anywhere else in the country. It's just this unit, right? And so it's difficult to say, oh, morale's low nationwide because one group of some people in the National Guard that you heard about in Alaska aren't happy. Okay. So, but that is a caveat. I have seen it grow and shift. I think it really does actually go back to the expectations. So when the first day I ever reported on the military, first time ever, was on the National Guard in Washington, D.C. So the D.C. Army National Guard. And this was a group of people who had joined primarily prior to 9/11. Okay, so this is 2005, and they are facing down the barrel of deployments, but they did not join to deploy. They did not join when Guard deployed overseas at all. They joined to have, for many of them, education benefits and some side income in Washington, D.C. Okay. So that group of people did have an expectation based off of reality that they wouldn't have to deploy. And of course, their morale was wildly moving back and forth because they were finding that their reality was shifting to a new normal, as we love to say. Okay. So then you have and you and I both were in a military culture that joined because of deployments, right? And so while deployment is hard, we took it on the chin and had a good attitude because we expected to deploy. We were here to deploy. We were here because of 9/11. Okay. And so that is a morale that seeps over time, because even if you expect something to be hard, when it's hard for a really long time and in ways you could not possibly have anticipated, no, I didn't know what I was getting into. How could a person, how could anyone, right? That is a slow drip, and that ebbs and flows based on how you're feeling in the moment. And unit cohesion, that beautiful word that means is everybody friends, and and just all of these sort of these values, these feelings, and feeling like we were taken care of for a period of time because the DoD flooded the military family stuff with money, and you could drop your kids off at the CDC for hourly care without really even having to work that hard for it, comparatively speaking. Okay. And then we have now a group of people who are joining or who have joined some of these people were not even, many of them were not even alive at 9/11. Okay. And so they're joining the military because it's what their family does, or because it's the best way to get it right out of town, or it's because they feel a higher calling, but then it doesn't mesh with what their friends are dealing with in the civilian workforce. And their spouses are feeling the same way. And it is harder than you thought it would be, because again, how could you possibly anticipate that the talk and the walk are not the same thing? And so you see morale really being driven by this idea of how things are supposed to work, and then how they actually work, and the cognitive dissonance around the idea that it is 2023. Things should not be this hard. It should not be possible to literally lose all of your stuff when you move. It should not be possible to live in housing that is so full of mold, everybody's sick, while everybody on the military housing side on your installation gaslights you and says it's your imagination. These are things that should not be happening, but they do. And the cognitive dissonance between that and this idea that it's 2023, we have the technology, is so blatant outside of the system that I think that in and of itself really impacts morale, because it's just doesn't make any sense.
No, and I think one of the things that really I was already aware of it, but it was just a lot more in my face while I was working on the book, was just the cognitive bias, the privileged perspective of even being an officer spouse, and realizing that just because I had this, initial first decade after 9/11 of all that flow of money and all of the resources. I mean, everywhere we were stationed throughout that first decade, I had a brand new house. Like, I mean, we would have to live in a hotel for 3 months waiting for it to be finished to walk in my brand new house. And that was not necessarily what enlisted families were going through. You know, when I teach, I always tell people, like, if you are that person that is going into this lifestyle and it's a grand adventure and that you're having the time of your life, like, that's not me. And I don't know if I can hang out with people like that. Like, but that's somebody else's experience that may not have had the experiences that other people have had. And all are true. All are true. But I feel like there's a lot of separation of what you just described. There are some people coming in that this is not what they felt like they were promised. And I'm hearing that from some Gen Z. And yet I think that there are some people that maybe have even been in for a while that are having a hard time comprehending and even believing that it could be true.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first of all, it is remarkable how quickly that housing fell apart, isn't it? Like that new house you were put in, like, what happened there?
What's fascinating, and we won't go into this, but what was fascinating over the years of doing this research, when I started following the money and realized 2013 sequestration in Odenero is saying we're going to have to cut 70% of installation maintenance. Funny enough, a few years later, what grows after 4 or 5 years? Mold.
That's right, buddy. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But it sure did like come out all of a sudden.
Yeah. So I think you're onto something there with not getting what you were promised. Yeah. Or felt like you were promised. And this is actually a theme that we see across military generations. And so there is a feeling among military retirees, I'm talking not recent retirees, I'm talking older retirees, okay, who have faced the song and dance of rising Tricare costs for a decade, that they were promised free healthcare and they have received not free healthcare. That this is a broken promise. In fact, I think it was 2013, we had maybe 12, sometime around the sequestration vibe. We had this Twitter storm of keep your promise, hashtag keep your promise. Okay. Because the funding was going away and people, retirees, active duty, felt that the military was backing out on a promise, unwritten, certainly spoken, to deliver benefits to retirees and currently serving that lived up to a certain standard, and then that the DoD had backed off of that. And for many, many people, that looked a lot like the cost of healthcare. It was really symbolized by the cost of healthcare. It was symbolized by talking about shutting down commissaries. Yeah. And really the people who are most upset about shutting down commissaries, this sort of like discussion that was happening at the time, were retirees. Even though statistics say the commissaries are used in decreasing amounts, not just by active duty, also by retirees, that retirees like to have the option of the commissary, but don't necessarily go there. It is symbolic of a promise. So if you're a bean counter, my bean counter friends, forgive the title, but if you are a budget hawk, okay, the commissary definitely looks like a waste of money. Yep, sure does. It does on paper, because people are using it in declining numbers. It costs an astronomical amount. It's employing all of these people on a GS scale. That means you're giving them full federal pensions for running a checkout at a grocery store. Okay, why does the DoD have a grocery store? All of these questions that really make a lot of sense if you're a budget hawk and reading a piece of paper. For everyone else, they're symbolic. They're symbolic of everything, and they're symbolic of broken promises. And so people just aren't fundamentally, human beings aren't okay with that. And if you want to get people real riled up, start talking about broken promises. Yeah. It's a banger. Which
goes back to, I think, your article. I think that's really what your article was really saying.
Yep.
So I also want to ask you, you're watching all of this continue to unfold, retention and recruitment numbers, all of that. What do you think of as far as what the DoD needs to do or what the culture needs to do? What are your opinions on what makes some of this better or easier or more successful?
Yeah. So, I will speak just from the military family perspective. I joked earlier that if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. That's kind of flippant, but it also happens to be true. And when I say mama, I mean the family. Okay. So if the service member is hearing at home that this is not sustainable for his or her family, it's not sustainable for his or her family. And they're eventually going to get out. And there goes all of the money you spent on training this person out the door because you couldn't get your life together on moving someone across the country without losing all of their stuff.
Yeah.
right? It is, in fact, 2023. We can do hard things. We do have the technology. And so the military has to figure out how to stop making this so complicated. And it is a big slow boat, and it does take a long time to turn that sucker around. Yes, it does. But it can be done. We have to start using the technology that we have to solve the simple problems without making it so friggin' complicated. And that can look like on the ground level at individual installations holding the housing contractors. These are not DoD employees. They are contractors. So there's a lot more that you can do accountable for their choices. And that's not just, is the house full of mold? That's how excited are you to respond to somebody who complains that their house is full of mold? What is the vibe? How much money are you charging people? And how many shenanigans are you allowing when people move out of the housing? And you go in to do a check. Are you having a same standard at the single installation? Are people being charged money that they do not owe because of the choices of the last person and that person wasn't held accountable? So on and so forth. And honestly, this is going to cost some money. It is, because the military, the other thing they don't do is pay a rate to the private providers that has them willing to do it. And so I'm talking now about moving industry, and I'm talking about healthcare. My local pharmacist told me that he takes Tricare pharmacy contract through Express Scripts at a loss. They operate at a loss. I know that many healthcare professionals experience that as well. I know that dentists experience that. If these contractors are not willing to pay a rate to these providers that is commensurate to what they're getting in the civilian sector from civilian providers, they're not going to keep them. And then military families aren't going to be able to get health care. And when you can't get something as basic as pharmacy coverage where you are, and yes, I know we have mail order. I'm talking about drugs you cannot receive in the mail. Okay. If we don't have something as basic as that, that's so fundamental to just getting through the day, that becomes this huge, burdensome annoyance that you just cannot with every day for the rest of your life. Yeah, you're going to get out and find different healthcare. You are, because it's just not worth it.
Yeah. And I think that's one of my biggest soapboxes and frustrations too is, and I've gone all the way to the top asking, how do we just hold contractors responsible and accountable? And it's frustrating when we can't do anything until this contract is up because of the way that contract was written. And relationally, I just don't like that answer, right? Because if you're doing business with someone and they're not doing a good quality job of running that business, then we're going to have words, right? We're going to have words of some kind. And so that's been one of my biggest frustrations. How does the DoD heal the feelings of betrayal and the feelings of broken promises with a whole cohort?
Yeah, wow. Could we find that answer and then sell it?
Yeah.
Is that an option? I honestly, I don't know the answer to that. I wish I did, because again, I think that would make me a lot of money. I think that practically speaking, it's one not broken promise at a time. Right. Yeah. It's keeping your word. It's passing policies and then, keeping the policy you pass. Crazy. One person at a time, because guess what? People talk. They talk so much. And that's why we're talking today, because we love to talk and because we talk. Okay. And because we know spouses talk. Things get around. If you start creating a culture where you're keeping the faith with folks, it's gonna get around, and decisions are gonna start being made based off of that. And when your next door neighbor decides to stay in the military and re-up, you might too. It is a slow roll, but the big ship has to start making the right moves. It just does.
You've been studying this culture. Well, I know we're almost out of time, but you've been studying this culture for so long. What do you feel like is coming?
I would love to get paid for that as well. No, I don't actually know. Because that would mean I'd have a crystal ball, Corie, and that would be so convenient for so many things other than this. No, I think we're at risk of seeing the same trajectory that we've already seen. Recruitment and retention it's not just a issue to sit down and talk about on a morning and, kind of laugh and joke about, like, this is serious business, right? And it's serious business not just because people have paychecks and they're in the military and that's so nice for them. It's serious business because it is fundamental to, keeping America safe, right? Yeah. Like this is very, very serious. What's coming, I hope, is the normal over time ebb and flow of this, where the culture corrects itself after creating a problem for itself that impacts recruitment and retention. This is not the first time that the military has seen problems with this. Mm-hmm. So I strongly suspect that as it has been, it will ever be. But I think that we are going to have to see the military make some corrections to how they approach family issues as a result of this generation of military service members and their families, if they want to course correct in a way that is sustainable.
It went off like a bang. Oh, everything, it changed in that moment. It went off like a bang. Blood coursed through my veins. Oh, oh. When those fatal words were spoken, that I was not your chosen. It went off like a bang.
Henrik Ibsen, a famous Norwegian playwright, once said, "1,000 words will not leave so deep an impression as one deed. When that deed breaks the trust of those we lead, it's a tough impression to recover from." Betrayal invokes something visceral within us, something primal. It is the sound of the halo effect fracturing as we come to terms with the reality that we gave more than the other was prepared or willing to reciprocate. After years of working with betrayal recovery, I can say both sides must be all in to save the relationship. The betrayer must have remorse, and the wounded must be willing to stay. Although 1,000 apologies count, the redemptive power of doing the right thing for the right reason for a really long time is what restores the relationship. Unfortunately, we might be running out of time. The Military Culture Shift podcast is sponsored by New Res and written and produced by me, author, speaker, and military clinical consultant Corie Weathers. The closing credit song is Bang by Modaspira. This is a supplemental leadership podcast for the book Military Culture Shift, The Impact of War, Money, and Generational Perspective on Morale, Retention, and Leadership. Copies of the book can be purchased on Amazon, militaryfamilybooks.com, and your other favorite retailers. More information, including graphs, data, and other resources mentioned in the book, can be found on my website, CorieWeathers.com.
I can't believe that you would ever bang, 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 How do you explain? How do you explain?